Education is another prominent social institution which is controlled by the government, which often comes under fire for supposedly being structurally racist. Only a few days ago, the new head of one of Britain's largest teaching unions was interviewed by the independent newspaper and announced one of his priorities to be addressing institutional racism across all schools. Though remarkably, the article didn't actually point to any examples of the endemic racism that supposedly haunts the system. Instead, it was simply assumed as a matter of course. Once again, when one looks into the government statistics, the accusation of institutional racism very quickly begins to fall apart. Much like with income statistics, the first major problem to emerge regarding the idea of racism having a significant influence on educational outcomes is that the highest performers are once again minority students. Students of Chinese ethnicity gain the best results at GCSE, closely followed by those of Indian ethnicity. Therefore, once again we are faced with the prospect of the discerning racist. Teachers would have to be discriminating against some minorities, but giving others a free pass. The figures become even more problematic for the hypothesis of institutional racism once we separate out the numbers for those who are eligible for free school meals and those who aren't. It turns out that socially deprived white British students achieve lower GCSE grades than any other major ethnic group, noticeably lower than black or Asian students of the same family income bracket. The average attainment of white British students is also more or less equal to or lower than every other major ethnic grouping, a very strange outcome for a system that is supposedly institutionally racist towards minorities. The only group who perform on average worse than the white British majority is black Caribbeans. If we try and explain this underperformance with reference to discrimination by teachers, then once again we are back at the problem of the discerning racist. This is because, on average, black Africans outperform white students despite broadly possessing the same ethnic characteristics as black Caribbean students. Therefore, racist teaching staff really must have it in for Caribbean students, whilst being prepared to give Africans and all other minorities a free pass, or even superior treatment to the white British majority. Just in any case anybody was in any doubt as to how wedded the teaching profession in the UK is to the doctrines of progressivism and left-wing ideals, one has only to consult how they voted in the last general election. According to the Times Educational Supplement, over 60% voted for Labour and a vanishing minority voted for right-wing parties. To put it mildly, the idea that the teaching profession is stacked full of racist bigots doesn't quite pass a credibility test. Alternatively, we could posit the idea that the behaviour of black Caribbean students might be where the problem lies. If we look at the figures for persistent absences from school, the same trend appears. Black African students are less likely to be persistently absent than white students, and Caribbean students are absent more than any other group. The same pattern also appears in the figures for permanent exclusions, more commonly known as school expulsions. The good news is that the number of Caribbean students being excluded is thankfully on the decline, but the overall pattern still remains. Probably the most significant explanation for this underperformance by Caribbean students is the prevalence of single-parent households, which are a predictor of poor educational performance across ethnic groups. 24% of black British households have only one parent, compared to 10% of the white British majority. This is something that is beyond the control of the education system and is something which produces outcomes for which they cannot and should not be blamed. When it comes to university admissions, once again the figures don't fit well with the institutional racism hypothesis. When one remembers that blacks account for only 3.5% of the population of the UK and Asians for 7%, both groups are overrepresented for their size in university admission numbers and whites are underrepresented. This is also importantly the case for high-tariff universities. There is, however, an interesting inequality in performance at university. White students appear to outperform all other ethnic groups when it comes to achieving first-class and upper second-class degrees. Could this finally be an example of institutional racism at work? finally making itself manifest right at the last moment as students complete their education. A survey conducted by the Sociology Department of the University of Bristol found when they asked students that some did believe they experienced some form of racial discrimination whilst at university. However, not only was that number only 7% of the total, but of that 7%, the majority said that the discrimination did not come from university teaching staff. Instead, they more commonly reported feeling discriminated against by fellow students or from members of the public from the surrounding area in which the university is located. The more likely explanation for such high performance from white university students is that they have a lower progression rate on average to university. A quarter of 18-year-old white British students decide to enter employment rather than go to university, which means that many of the students who would otherwise have achieved a low result in their degree are not attending university and therefore are bringing the average up. This can be evidenced also by the fact that white students are particularly underrepresented at medium and lower tier universities. Therefore, a smaller percentage of white students go to universities where they otherwise might be expected to get lower grades. Instead, they seem much more likely to sign up to an apprenticeship instead of continuing in academic study. Once we have done analysing educational results, the other major area of discussion with regards to ethnic minorities is the supposed whitewashing of the curriculum, or the lack of priority given to promoting the history of ethnic minorities. MPs from various opposition parties have called upon the Education Secretary to review the curriculum in response to the recent Black Lives Matter protests which have occurred around the country. The main problem with this argument is that such content is already present on the history curriculum. If you go to the AQA website and have a look at the specification for GCSE history, then the evidence of this is right in front of you. For Section A of Paper 1, out of 4 units that might be studied, 2 cover the history of the United States of America and contain sections of the history of African Americans, and another one of the units is on Nazi Germany, the implications for which in terms of educating young people about racism should be obvious. For Section A of Paper 2, students must study the history of the United Kingdom, and in all of the units on offer, issues of race and migration are present. GCSE students are to learn about the Brixton riots, the Scarman Report, and the Windrush migration. In addition to all of this, every October is Black History Month, where secondary students of all ages are encouraged to think and learn about Black history. One of the problems of demanding more time on the history curriculum for one subject or another is that those who do the demanding very rarely explain which subjects need to be gotten rid of in order to make room. If we want more history dedicated to Britain's minority populations, then should we strike the Nazis from the list? Is Stalin to be removed? Will Mao ever make it onto the list? What aspects of international history should students be denied in order to make room? Should students be left ignorant of the Cold War, or the political development of their own country, or the moral evils of communism? Seldom, however, will you hear an answer to this question, as more and more special concerns get loaded onto the timetable, which has seemingly unlimited time and space to accommodate all who wish to add something onto it. One final note should go to those individuals who are actually making a difference to the educational outcomes of deprived students. People like Catherine Bibalzing, a mixed-raced headmistress who decided to set up her own school after writing a book recounting her experiences as a teacher in mainstream secondary education. She was appalled by the way in which progressive theories of education, as well as low disciplinary standards, were betraying the prospects of students from working class and minority backgrounds. She was also disturbed by the way in which teachers and teaching unions were always prepared to blame the spectre of racism as being the real cause of the underperformance of students from minority backgrounds. Modelling her own school on a famously strict approach towards discipline and reverting to traditional methods of knowledge-centred instruction, Bibalzing and her teachers have worked wonders at their school located in inner-city London. Mihaela Academy's GCSE results for 2019 speak for themselves. over half of her students managed to achieve a minimum of 5 A grades. The school's results are 4 times higher than that of the national average, despite being a state school. Catherine Bibb shows us that success is not to be found in peddling grievance narratives, but instead by conditioning children to believe that they can transcend their social deprivation through hard work and dedication. If anyone actually truly cared about improving the educational outcome of students, then they would not be seeking the advice of Black Lives Matter or the teaching unions. They would instead be seeking advice from Catherine Bibb and asking her how her model might be best implemented across the entire system, so that the life prospects as well as the educational outcomes of millions of students might be transformed.